the title of my talk is Teacher-Student Interactions within Elementary Classrooms Serving Students with Autism. And I am faculty here at UC Davis in the School of Education and the Mind Institute. So before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge a few folks with a very special shout out to my colleagues, Nancy Zheng and Aubin Stamer, also my doctoral students and the video coders in my research lab. So I wanted to get started by showing you a transcript that is from a recent publication. Within this transcript, this transcript was taken from the beginning of a vocabulary activity from a reading intervention. There's an interventionist and two students with autism, and they're sharing a book together. It starts with the interventionist posing a question, so what's a laundromat? And then she waits a bit, and when she doesn't get a response back from the students, she says, okay, well, it will tell us in the book, let's find out. So student one leans in to turn the page of the book, and she says, wait a second, student one, I have to read the page first. So this is being responsive to that action. He gets upset, and then she kind of validates that. It's okay, student one, you can turn the page after I read the words. So then student one waits to turn the page. The interventionist points to the page and says, so what is she doing? And student two jumps in and says, she's cleaning up. The interventionist then says, yeah, she's helping her daddy clean up by putting laundry into the machine. See how she's helping her daddy? And then student one jumps in and says, laundry. So notice in this example transcript, just the range of language categories that the interventionist is using. There's open-ended questions, closed-ended questions, and she's using a lot of responsive language. Also notice that back and forth, or that reciprocity between all three of them. So here's another example taken from the same intervention and the same activity. But notice in this one that we don't see that variability in language. So it starts off with a lot of redirecting of student behavior, 12 instances of redirects to be specific. So that would sound something like this. Sit down, look over here, hands quiet, sit down, don't touch that. Sit here in the chair, put that down. What was the rule? Over here, come sit down in your chair, don't touch that. Look here at the book. And then finally this one, student one jumps in and says, time to go. Oh, are we all done? And then it goes back to some redirects. So in the second example, the interventionist primarily uses language to direct or redirect students' behavior to comply in a specific manner. And that jeopardizes the quality of this interaction. The interventionist does not deliver key session material as outlined in the curriculum because the session is primarily consisting of bids to manage off-task behaviors. So in turn, the students are not presented with opportunities to participate in this reading-based activity. So I just wanted to highlight that these two transcripts were taken from the same intervention at the same time, but with two different interventionists and 4 different children. It really reflects kind of the high variation that we see in the amount and type of language that teachers use with their students, specific student characteristics such as the influence of problematic behavior that influences teachers' talk, and then the link between teacher and student engagement. And overall, this highlights differences and potential inequities in learning opportunities that students with autism are receiving in educational settings. And it also kind of highlights interaction as a potential key indicator for quality of an interaction. So as we move forward with the presentation, I hope for 3 things. One, I hope that you begin to notice or become aware of the amount and types of talk that teachers are using within activities, classroom activities specifically. And also that you begin to consider that language might be an intervention target, since small changes in teacher language reflect and shape the learning opportunity for students. And then finally, I hope that you can, within this presentation and beyond, reflect on the amount and type of language that you're currently using with your students and how it might shape the learning opportunity. So next, I wanted to present some findings from a project that my colleague, Dr. Zhang, and I are currently working on. We're evaluating math learning opportunities for students with autism. So we've focused on math because of ineffective instruction in math remains this critical problem across the United States. And the literature suggests that many students with disabilities typically engage in very low, rigorous math activities, despite evidence saying that they are able to engage in more rigorous kind of grade level mathematics. Identifying and evaluating math practices in students with autism is just a highly understudied area. There's not much research on it currently. So this highlights the need for further understanding of the practices that impact the quality of math learning opportunities for students with autism. And here this graph just shows that only about 13% of students with disabilities are performing at or above, at a proficient level of math by the 4th grade. So the purpose of this project was really to look at the nature of and variability in mathematics instruction that's provided to students with autism from preschool through 3rd grade. And we used classroom video observations to really look at mathematics lessons. Our aims were to identify and describe instructional opportunities, teacher language and student engagement that occurs during mathematics tasks, and to evaluate or examine the relationship among teacher language, student engagement, and student level characteristics, such as the presence or absence of problematic behavior or students' IQ. So just briefly, our sample consisted of 58 preschool through 38 through 3rd grade students with autism across California, and their 36 general and special education teachers. Our sample of students ranged in terms of their cognitive abilities, the presence of their autism symptoms, teacher-rated adaptive behavior, and teacher-rated problem behavior. In terms of math instruction, we developed or pulled from a model from a general education model that really looks at mathematics based on cognitive demand. So these 4 areas or 4 tasks that we observed. The first being recall and reproduction tasks that really focus on rote, recall, or memorization, such as counting or matching numbers. Procedural tasks focus on learning and practicing standard algorithms. So this would be like learning about regrouping or using different strategies to really understand the steps of specific math problems. Conceptual tasks focus on understanding math concepts. Often they consist of using manipulatives for students to be able to really demonstrate their understanding of a particular math concept. And then finally, problem-solving tasks really tap into students' ability to reason or think critically about math. So in terms of the language environment, we looked at a range of different types of language and the amount of language that teachers were doing within mathematics tasks. We specifically pulled from 4 different categories of teachers' language, and we coded each instance that teachers used these different categories of language. The first is our directives. So thinking about both non-task and task-related directives, which I'll give you an example of in a minute. The next is responsive language. So this includes language that is immediate and effectively positive, and it follows students' communication or communication attempts. Open-ended questions consist of questions that teachers asked students in a manner that was open so that students can generate their own answers, such as, how do you think we can solve this problem? And then closed-ended questions are questions that are structured in a manner to elicit a specific response, such as, what two numbers do you need to include in this problem? It's important to note that open-ended questions and responsive language have been identified as key features within the literature that indicate quality of an interaction. And then just to give you the examples of what we mean by non-task related and task related directives, non-task related are those directives that we saw at the beginning in that transcript too, such as sit down or get your pencil or quiet hands. Those are directives that don't have anything to do with math instruction. Task-related directives, on the other hand, have to do with learning math. So these examples would be something like the teacher saying, show me 4 counters on your number strip, or touch the number 5. And then finally, in terms of student engagement, we pulled from 3 related dimensions that were adapted from the classroom measure of active engagement to look at the amount of time that students spent in a well-regulated or dysregulated state. So this is their ability to really monitor and effectively manage their physiological arousal or emotional states. The amount of time that they had access to the learning materials and were using them as intended. And then finally, the number of instances or the number of times that they directed both verbal and nonverbal communication toward another person. And so what did we find? So interestingly, we found that teachers on average designated about 15 minutes toward mathematics learning, but they only spent about 11 minutes engaged in mathematics instruction. About 25% of tasks on average went to transitioning or thinking about managing problematic behavior. Of the 90 tasks that we observed, we found that teachers most likely delivered recall tasks, so those kind of rote learning tasks, and procedural tasks. So tasks that involve learning the steps to carry out a problem. We saw much fewer conceptual tasks, and we only observed 1 out of the 90 tasks to be problem solving. Something interesting to point out is outside of our framework, we saw these other tasks that teachers were delivering that seemed to be not really tapping into math learning. So one was following directions. So there were times where it was like all math learning kind of went down, and it's much more simplified, such as put the red one here or put the number 5 here. So the student just had to follow these directions that teachers were giving. But 5% of the tasks included multiple objectives. And so it was really hard to kind of pull out what was the math learning objective. And then about 4% of our tasks just included times where students didn't have opportunities to really engage in math learning. And this consists of things like listening to songs about math. In terms of the type and amount of teacher language that we observed within those 90 tasks, we found that teachers most frequently delivered non-task related directives. That was the most kind of prominent type of language that we saw. So those would include examples such as, sit down or get your pencil. We saw high variability in teachers' use of responsive language, with some teachers delivering or being very responsive to their students, while others weren't very responsive at all. We saw very few task-related directives, and we only observed, in 3 tasks, we only observed open-ended questions out of the 90. And last, in terms of students' engagement, we saw that students overall were pretty well regulated, that they were able to manage their physiological arousal and behavior to match those tasks about 72% of the time. But they were much less productive. So we saw that students on average were productive about 32% of the time. What we did notice that, though, is that students only had access to materials about 43% of the time. So this is highly related to them being productive if they do or do not have access to materials. And then finally, we observed that students initiated communication about 6 times during the tasks. So what types of language do teachers use during varying math tasks, and how does this relate to student engagement? So interestingly, during recall tasks, we saw that students were rarely productive, and we saw that teachers did not use a lot of language. So this is an example from one of our videos of a recall task. So this would be those more rote tasks. The teacher's holding up flashcards and asking the students, what's 3 times 6? And the students are just coming up with answers. So one student says 19, and the teacher shakes her head, and then he comes back and says 18. So this task went on for about 16 minutes with some breaks in between, but you can see there's not a lot of variability in the language that the teacher is using. And again, kind of comes back to this low frequency of teacher use or language use. In terms of procedural and conceptual tasks, we found that there was more language overall in these types of tasks. But something that was really interesting is that we found that in conceptual tasks, teachers were much more responsive to students, to their communication. And we also found that students were more well-regulated, that they spent more time in a well-regulated state during conceptual tasks. So as an example of a conceptual task from one of our videos, you can see here that the teacher is providing the student with materials and wants the student to demonstrate his understanding of the numbers 1 through 5. So he's using these materials and filling these fish bowls with fish to really demonstrate that he understands what it means to count from 1 to 5. The teacher is using open-ended questions such as, what do you see? Responsive language, closed-ended questions. So you see this kind of variability in language. And then you see this nice reciprocity between the teachers and the students taking turns. So we found that when we looked at the relationship between teacher language, student engagement, and student characteristics, we found that teachers' use of responsive language was related to students being more productive and spending more time in a well-regulated state. We also found that teachers' responsive language was related to students being more well-behaved and having stronger adaptive behavior. So this is interesting and kind of poses 2 questions. Are teachers more likely to be responsive to students who are well-regulated, well-behaved, or more independent? Or does this work the other way? Are students more likely to be well-regulated, well-behaved, and more independent when teachers are more responsive? And then finally, what drives the decisions teachers make about the types of tasks they present to their students? Well, in part, we found that students' cognitive abilities and the presence or absence of problematic behavior drives those decisions, such that teachers are more likely to deliver those recall or rote tasks with students who demonstrate more cognitive impairment. And teachers are more likely to deliver conceptual tasks to students who they perceive as being better or more well-behaved. So in sum, we found that different mathematical tasks afford different learning opportunities for students, with teachers primarily delivering tasks that are more low or low to medium kind of cognitive demand. And so this kind of raises this question of, are students with autism receiving equitable opportunities to participate in productive struggle? Are they having opportunities to really think about mathematics? And are teachers providing opportunities to really kind of push their thinking about mathematics? Another kind of key finding here is that students rarely had access to materials, especially during recall tasks. And so this might point to a need for continued professional development, specifically in terms of mathematics instruction. It could be that students with autism may need different types of materials and different ways for them to be able to share their thinking in both verbal and nonverbal manners, such as just providing them manipulatives or different types of materials. And then finally, we found that these student level characteristics, specifically thinking about cognitive abilities and the presence or absence of problem behaviors, were really kind of driving, in part, the decisions that teachers made about the opportunities that they presented to students. So this could point really again to this need to really think about students with autism as capable learners with strengths and competencies. And this relates back to that original, the original literature that I had shared with you, that often students with disabilities are receiving math instruction that is kind of less rigorous. And so it's possible that for students with autism, if we focus on their strengths, their features of autism as strengths to support their mathematics learning, that this might be a nice strategy to get students really engaged and to push their thinking a bit. And that is it. Thank you.
I see there's one interesting question here. How do we utilize these sorts of data for students who are currently learning from home?
I feel that, we have to be creative and really thinking about what this can mean in an environment that is remote. So if we think about students' engagement, just an example would be thinking about engaging with specific types of materials. It could be that making sure that students are provided with materials so that then when they're involved in something that is remote, they have something in front of them that they can then use. So that's just one example of how that can be translated into remote.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.